Park Church. Welcome back to Bible class here at the park, where we are marching through the story. It's been such a great series, so illuminating how the story gets played out. We so often end up kind of plucking out different stories from the Bible and treating them as our own thing, and not treating the Bible as one big giant story that is the story of our lives. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to Bible class here at the park. We are marching through the story. This has been such a great series. We're excited about where we've come and what we've learned and what we're going to continue to learn as we go. We're starting today in chapter 13 of the story, entitled The King Who Had It All. And in your normal Bibles, if you want to follow along, we're going to be starting in the book of 1 Kings. Last week we dealt a lot with the man of David and who he was, the great man of God that he was, and the downturn that his life took, and God's response to that, and his response to being called out on his own sin. Just an incredible arc of a story we see with David. But we see that it's now time for David to pass on the baton, for him to pass on the throne. So we are dealing today with the man Solomon. And so we start in 1 Kings, where we jump around a little bit today, but the primary part of the story that we're in your normal Bibles, is the book of 1 Kings. Solomon is known for several things. He's known as being David's son and being king. He's known for his wisdom. He's known for building the temple. He's known for leading Israel just at its height, politically, theologically, a time of peace. It was an amazing time in Israel's history. So many great things. They were honoring God. They were fulfilling God. They had a great leader in David, and that carried them a long way. And so just at their cultural height is when Solomon was king over Israel. But then we see his downfall as he kind of devolves into these great words, syncretism and idolatry. Syncretism being he synchronized, he took on parts of cultures that were around him, marrying the daughters of the surrounding kings for the sake of alliances, and married up to 700 women and had a whole bunch of other concubines. He had just adopted so many things of other cultures, and we'll get into that more. But also what that involved was a significant amount of idolatry that he let himself slide into. He's known for a couple of pretty significant writings, at least a couple. The significant writings that we have in our Bible that we attribute to Solomon, whether he was the author of the entirety of them, or he's just given credit, or he was the inspiration of these. There's not a whole lot of real clear, especially with the second one. But the book of Proverbs is attributed to Solomon, rightly so. He's the author of many of the Proverbs. But also the book of Ecclesiastes is attributed to Solomon in very different times of his life. And we'll get to some of that here in a minute as well. So, 1 Kings, we see that really, if you look in your story book, if you're following along in the story, we really pick up pretty heavily in the second half of chapter 1 and then into chapter 2. I want to start reading in chapter 2, 1 Kings chapter 2. It says, "When the time drew near for David to die, he gave a charge to Solomon, his son. And he said, I'm about to go the way of the earth. So be strong, act like a man, and observe what the Lord your God requires. Walk in obedience to him and keep his decrees and commands, his laws and regulations as written in the law of Moses, Do this so that you may prosper in all you do and wherever you go, and that the Lord may keep his promise to me, which is, if your descendants watch how they live, and if they walk faithfully before me with all their heart and soul, you will never fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel. So David gives this charge to Solomon, and Solomon becomes king. And the Lord asks Solomon, because of who your father is, because of how this has all gone down, ask me for whatever you want as king, and I will give it to you. And this is one of the highlight parts of the story of Solomon that we talk about a lot. When God says, I'll give you whatever you want. What would you ask for? I mean, this is the ultimate genie in a bottle. God says, you get whatever you want. Solomon asks for more wisdom, which I feel like takes a decent amount of wisdom to even ask for that. So he has a good head on his shoulders already, but asks for more wisdom. And man, the Lord gives it to him in abundance. Some great stories of his wisdom being shown and brought forth. So we get to 1 Kings chapter 5 and 6, and Solomon prepares for the building and furnishing the temple. And a really detailed portion of scripture devoted to the description of the building of the temple, its furnishings, and the Ark of the Covenant was brought in. It was dedicated. He did this all right. He built it exactly like God asked him to. He used the best materials. It was an amazing time in the history of Israel. And then the Lord answers his dedication in chapter 9 of 1 Kings by saying a series of things. If you fill in the blank, then I will do this. The Lord appears to Solomon. 1 Kings chapter 9. The Lord said to him, I have heard the prayer and plea you have made before me. I have consecrated this temple which you have built by putting my name there forever. My eyes and heart will always be there. As for you, if you walk before me faithfully with integrity of heart and uprightness, as David your father did, and do all I command and observe my decrees and laws, I will establish your throne forever over Israel, as I promised David your father when I said, you shall never fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel. But if you and your descendants turn away from me and do not observe the commands and decrees I have given you, and go off to serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land I've given them and will reject this temple I have consecrated for my name. Israel will then become a byword and an object of ridicule among the people. The temple will be in a heap of rubble. Things will not go well. If you follow my commands, then I will do this. As for you, if you follow my commands, then you get to continue to be a part of what I am doing. If you don't, I will wipe it all out and I will continue forward. So pretty strong statements here from the Lord, to say the least. But things are good. Things are at their height. Man, the temple is built. But then the fame, the fortune, the greatness of Solomon, it seems to get a hold of him, and he begins to devolve. In chapter 11, Solomon takes on many wives and more concubines on top of that, and he then starts to take on not only hundreds of wives and relationships for the sake of political alliances, which you feel like probably didn't have to do that. God's on your side and he's going to take care of you. You probably didn't need to do all that, but he let his heart and emotions take over. And not only did he take on these relationships, he took on the cultures of these relationships. So allowed people, just build idols to whatever God you want and worship them. I'll worship them with you. It'll be all good. It's all fine. Let's just all get along, and we can all worship whoever we want. Well, that ends up being the downfall of Solomon. And what ends up happening, if you look back in Deuteronomy 17, there's this passage of how God's people and how kings should interact with God and how they should relate with him, how they should be in a relationship with him. And we see Solomon here disobeying, breaking every single one of those things. The story is also retold in the book of Chronicles, First Chronicles, Second Chronicles, actually, I believe, chapter 5 through 9. And so Solomon goes to his absolute height and then comes crashing down with the Lord. Verse 14 of chapter 11, then the Lord raised up against Solomon an adversary, Hadad the Edomite, from the royal line of Edom. And so now God has begun to set himself against Solomon and has taken away, it is in the process of taking away the throne from his lineage. So there's a few things I think we need to just pay attention to. And then we'll see what the kind of upper story of this part of the story is telling us. One thing we need to pay attention to during the height of his reign is when people were coming from all over the place, most notably the Queen of Sheba, but people were coming from all over the place to just sit and listen to Solomon because of his wisdom. And in his book of Proverbs, what we see is him saying, it's not just a bunch of wise phrases, but go get wisdom. Go get understanding. Proverbs 1, verse 22 says this, how long will you who are simple love your simple ways? How long will you who are simple love your simple ways? Now, what does simple mean in this? I take this to mean that people who aren't really paying attention, or who are not trying to make their entire life about obeying God and God being in a relationship with him and what that means in every aspect of your life. Being simple, just kind of checked out, not paying attention to what God's doing in you, around you, and what he desires to do through you. How long will you stay in your simple ways? But we go to the next proverb over. Proverbs 2. Let me just read for a second from Proverbs chapter 2, starting at the beginning. My son, if you accept my words and store up my commands within you, turning your ear to wisdom and applying your heart to understanding. Indeed, if you call out for insight and cry out for understanding, if you look for its silver and search for it as for hidden treasure, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom, and from his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. Solomon is encouraging people, not just listen to my wisdom, but go get wisdom. Seek understanding. Seek for it with all your heart. So that is his plea to everyone, and it's something that we need to pay attention to. At the height when things are going perfectly well, what he's telling everyone is go get wisdom, go get understanding. We even see this repeated in a way in the New Testament. Philippians chapter 1, verse 9 and 10. This is my prayer, says Paul, that your love may abound more and more in knowledge and in depth of insight, wisdom and understanding, so that you may be able to discern what is best and may be pure and blameless for the day of Christ. So the prayer for us still, ask God for wisdom, seek understanding, and then you will know the fear of the Lord. Then you will be able to discern what is best and may be pure and blameless for the day of Christ. Second thing I think we need to pay attention to, just briefly, is that the building of the temple, it could be read that, God, we're going to do this for you. This is for you. Well, we know that the temple is for our benefit, not for God's. God does not need a place built by human hands. Indeed, God cannot fit inside anything. He can't fit inside the entire heavens and the earth. Certainly anything made by human hands, says Solomon, you can't fit there. Why should we do this? So what the purpose of the temple is it is for our worship and our understanding of God. It's the place where heaven and earth meet. It's a place where we gain understanding of who God is, who He's calling us to be, and gives us a place to where we can meet with Him. So the temple is an amazing part of this entire story, but it is, and we see several of these. We see this being a pattern that we need to pay attention to, is where are the places where heaven and earth intersect. And those are the places where God is, where He meets us, and where we really need to pay attention. And the temple, as the tabernacle was, the temple is one of those places. It's for our worship and for our understanding of God. And number 3, just as David did in our previous chapter of the story, don't get comfortable and lose sight of who you are, of whose you are, of the times that you're living in. Continue to stay focused on what God is doing in you, what God is doing through you. And all along, God is saying, this is not about what you are able to do. This is about you remaining faithful to me and what I will do with you and through you in all of the earth and all of creation, restoring what I have begun, what I started. So, message to us today, to pay attention. Don't get too comfortable. We fast, like we mentioned last week, we fast as a reminder that it's not yet time for the feast. David's downfall began when he forgot the times he was in and didn't go off to war during the times when kings go off to war. He stayed home. He forgot where he was. He got relaxed. He got comfortable. Solomon, at the height of his reign and all this power and glory that he had, let the surrounding cultures inundate his world. And because he didn't want to push people away, he held more strongly to his alliances to other people than he did his alliance to God. And that was his main downfall. And then we see God's punishment. And this is interesting to understand. One of the greatest passages that help us to understand God and His character is how God describes Himself to Moses on top of Mount Sinai in Exodus 34. But there's this really interesting passage. It's one that you almost want to, for me, I kind of wanted to cut it off the end of this because the rest of it seems so nice to hear and beautiful, and then it talk about God punishing people in it. But here is out here. Exodus 34, starting verse 6. And he passed in front of Moses proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Boy, that sounds really, really great. But he goes on, and pay attention. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sins of the parents to the third and fourth generation. What's really interesting here is the Lord told Solomon, I'm going to take away the throne from you, but because of your father David, I'm not going to do it in your lifetime, but I'm going to take it away from your son. So we see the sins of generations lasting to the third and fourth generation, just as God promised. So we see even in his punishment, even in his judgment over us, we see his character remaining faithful. And it's during this time I think it's at the end of his life that he, if he turns out to be the author of Ecclesiastes, which I'd say there's as good a chance as any that he is. Ecclesiastes is known, if you've read through Ecclesiastes, as being a little bit depressing. There's this word, everything is hevel. Hevel is the Hebrew word. We translate it meaningless. A better, more literal definition would be is vapor. It's here and it's gone. You try to grab onto it and it's gone. You can't ever get a hold of it. It's worthless to try to chase after and make it about who you are. And so he goes through, the entire scope of the human experience and says it's all hevel. It's all just meaningless, grasping after the wind, because he's been through all this. He's been to the height. He's seen what power and money can do. It's hevel. It's meaningless. It's vapor. He's seen what learning and growing in, we just talked about growing in wisdom and understanding. I think that's different than making your entire life about gaining as much head knowledge and reading all the books, and that too can be looked at as a chasing after the wind. But what we need to pay attention to is this is at the end of his life, and he has a new perspective now, that he has been at the top and has now come down, and now he can, just because he made a bunch of bad choices that dishonor God, does not mean he has lost his sense of wisdom and understanding. So he sees for himself, he looks back on his life and sees, here's what it all comes down to. Fear God, keep his commandments. And so that is the big overarching story of the man of Solomon. And so we get to this portion of the story really concludes in 1 Kings chapter 11. And what we see here is Solomon has gone from height to depth, and now the kingdom is in real trouble, and things are only going to get worse from here. But what we see God doing in this upper story is that this is the beginning of the downfall of Israel. Remember where Israel's been. They got the king that they wanted in Saul. They got the king that they needed in David. And then God continues to bless Israel with this man of wisdom and stature in Solomon. But we see of all our human effort, the only thing that remains faithful is God. The only thing that remains faithful is God. And so our human effort is not the focus of our lives, and trying to do the best we can just to please God, and I'm going to try harder and harder, and we see that that's just a chasing after the wind, and God is really the one who is faithful to his covenant to us. God is the one who is faithful to the point of continuing on this lineage all the way to Jesus, and continuing his faithfulness to us in sending his own son to the cross to die for our sins so that we can live with him forever, as was the plan all along. So it's God who is faithful above all else. Let's remember today God's faithfulness and remain faithful to him. And let's not spend our days chasing after the wind. Love you guys. Thanks for being with us today. We'll see you next time.